Okay, real quick before we talk about drop target shadows, I want to show you something that I think is really cool. I moved this project over to Blender 2.83, which is in its final version now. And you've seen as we work how, fairly often while rendering, the viewport display stays pretty noisy because you just can't quickly get enough samples to see this well. Well, now there's this viewport denoising that is optics accelerated. So if you have an RTX card, you get to really finally enjoy what it can do. But apparently this works with your CPU as well. I don't understand how that works, but so check this out. In the viewport, if I go to render, we start with a really noisy sample for like a second. Let me get rid of this. There. See how it was noisy for like a second? And then all of a sudden the denoising snaps in. So a denoised viewport is just revolutionary as far as being able to work. And then, the more samples you let it go, the cleaner it gets. So you can see the kind of the deficiency, the noise you get with low sample denoising. But, I mean, this is unbelievable. I could not be more excited to have that. So, yeah, just really cool. All right, anyway. So what we're doing today is we are going to render out the drop target shadows. And so what we're going to do is actually eliminate most elements from what we have here. So we're going to do that by just creating a full copy, a brand new scene. It'll take a second. There it is. There's our brand new scene. And then what we want to do is just find the pieces of this that are essential to rendering out the drop targets. So that is the drop targets themselves. And as we select these, we'll get a few extra pieces we don't want, but that's okay. So 11 drop targets. And then here's going to be the part that's hard to grab real easily. We've got some GI lights here that we want to make sure we bring over. So other stuff can just get deleted. So essentially we just made a whole additional copy of our project in this additional scene. Because we want to use, instead of like going through and turning everything off, which can be a little arduous, we're just going to use this second scene. There we go, get rid of the extras. And okay, so what we have left is, or are 11 drop targets and a couple of GI lights. And everything else here, we want to, you can either delete or just completely turn off because they will mess up what we're doing. We will need a new camera, but I'll do that in a minute. So, looking at this from directly overhead, see screencast keys, even though it says they're on. I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to create a new plane. We're going to put it right at playfield level because that's where the shadows are hitting. And we're going to position it, roughly in a place where the shadows are going to fall. I'm not going to do these two drop targets. In fact, I'll just delete those because there are no shadows whatsoever from this light. And then these other drop targets, we want to turn off for rendering. We only want, in fact, this one too for now. We just want to do one at a time. So if we look at this rendered right now, we have this flat plane and you can see where the shadows are going. But what we actually want to do is change this to a shadow catcher, and that's right here. So now you have just the shadows, and for your drop targets, you don't want them visible to the camera, but you want them rendering. And for rendering right now, I only have this one on. You can see these others are off. Okay, so then we want to create a new camera. And this camera we want to place directly overhead. I don't want it that big. There's no detail on these shadows. You can make them pretty low resolution. They could be smaller than this if I was worried about the size of my file, but I'm not. All right, so with this camera selected, we want to just move. We want to look through it like that, and then position it directly overhead. You can do that by looking at this. You know, as long as we're at 0, 0, 0, we're directly overhead. And we want to change the type of camera from perspective, which has a focal length and lens distortion. We want to change it to orthographic. So everything's getting mapped 1:1. And then our scale goes to, zooms in until we're more or less fill up the frame here. Perfect. Okay, so that's our camera view. You know, you can do an overhead orthographic camera view when you're rendering your playfield as well, if you prefer that to an angle. But what you lose is the reflections from your perspective as a player. Anyway, something to think about. Okay, so now GPU, optics accelerated. Obviously, your settings are going to differ here. But denoising doesn't typically work well with shadow layers, so sometimes you have to really crank up your number. Even for a low detail thing, I'm going to put this at 500 and see how this turns out. But your render should be relatively quick. Let me save a dummy copy before we go here. Just kind of safety, because I moved to 2.83, there may be things that don't behave the way I want. So take a look at what we get, how long it takes. Yeah, it looks like we're looking at maybe a 20-second render per shadow if this is clean enough, and that's perfectly acceptable. There it is. And from a resolution standpoint, it's not real noisy. I don't see a lot of noise. Maybe that'll change when I bring it into Photoshop, but that's fine. So for 20 seconds, that's great. I forget the switch names, and I'm not going to bother with them right now. So right now we'll just call this switch center 2. And I'll show you how we set these up. So you can use flat primitives like this and put that with some transparency on the playfield. But what happens is you end up with some weird depth bias things, especially with a ball shadow or a flipper shadow, that creates some weird distortions in visual pinball. So you don't actually want to do that. You want to place this image on a flasher. But in order to place your flasher, you need a map to show where that shadow is supposed to end up. So what we want to do is we want to do a UV map of this plane. We want to do it project from view bounds. So that's going to give us out to the corners all the way around. So that if we, anyway. So we can open up Photoshop. You can see that I'm doing this the same day as I finished the spinner stuff. It's a little bit of a cheat there. I did the spinner stuff the other day, but messed up the wrap up, so There we go. All right, so here's this, and just like before, we're gonna trim the transparent pixels. All right, and then we can just save that as a PNG. Okay. Oh. Quick on the draw. So what we can do is take this now that it's been UV mapped out to the corners, and we can export it, and we can call this like a drop plate center, because we're going to use this same plate for all of the shadows from this bank of drop targets. And we're going to export it, and then in Visual Pinball we're going to just grab any mesh that's scaled correctly, and we'll call this drop plate center, so it's easy to find and delete because this isn't going to stay in the game. And then go to our meshes, find that mesh, turn on 1 in the editor so you can actually see it. There it is. I'm going to move it to oh, come on, it's so hard to grab. All right, move it to a layer that's a little more empty so we can work. Okay, and then what you want to do is you want to create a flasher. Set the flasher height to 1 or 0.1 or whatever, and you're going to need a depth bias that things can show through, so change it to something negative. What you're going to do is you're going to match up as closely as possible, and you can be incredibly precise if you want, or you can kind of eyeball it and then adjust on the fly. Either one works. So that's, pretty close. So that's going to take that texture that we just resized, and it's going to map it accurately. I think. So, and what did I call that? Of course, I didn't pay attention. Center 2. And we'll just leave all this for now. It's visible, and we really don't want any color there. So we should be able to just turn this on, and I think we should be able to see it. Nope. Because our other playfield is over it. Our GI off one, yep, there it is. And it looks like I have the wrong texture map to these, but you can tell it's there. So that's good, I guess. Oh, I see. Flasher went over there. And the mesh is still there, and we don't need it anymore. So we get rid of the mesh. Okay. And you can actually preview this. If you turn on solid, you can see it, and you can also see what the problem is here. So we could just rotate this 180 degrees, I think, Oh, you know what? Let's not do that. I'll turn my camera for the rest of these so I don't have to do this in Photoshop. But that's really what we should do. Okay, there we go. There we go, that's correct. And then if we actually look, you can see that that is positioned, you know, very accurately. If that was off, you could just wiggle this around until it fits, and that's fine. Okay, and then the last thing we want to do, because I think I already have this array set up for the drop targets, I want to take flasher 23, kill it, and then call this flasher 23. So that'll actually be responsive now. All right, this might be a little faint, but fingers crossed it should be visible. Yep, there it is. Yep, looks fine. And when that target goes down, that shadow should also disappear. So you can see the importance then of rendering all of your lighting with your drop targets off or not visible, so you can add these things. And then, yeah, shadow's gone, shadow's back. Shadow's gone, shadow's back. Okay, so then, look, all you do is repeat this ad nauseum. It gets really easy after this. I mean, it's really fast. You just turn that off, turn this on, render, resize in Photoshop, import, and then over and over. So, tedious, yes. Worth it for the detail. I think in the case of drop shadows, yes. If you've ever tried to do drop shadows with GI lights in Visual Pinball, you know that placing points precisely is extremely difficult, and shaping the lights to have cutouts and then adding an additional light inside of that cutout for when the drop target is down is far more fiddly. The results aren't as good. I mean, it doesn't look as nice, and I mean, it's just an insipid process. And so even though this is, you know, gripeable, I really don't think that this is worse than actually doing it in Visual Pinball with by shaping lights. If you don't know what I'm talking about, just count yourself among the fortunate. So anyway, I'll keep going on this and finish it up offline, and then I think we just have inserts to do and our project will be done, which sounds really good to me. Thanks for joining me. See you later. Let me just jump back in here real quick. You know, I was talking about not using primitives but using flashers for drop target shadows. If you haven't yet, switching over your ball shadows, and that can be done just with a one-to-one replacement of how you're titling it. You don't have to change scripting or anything. And also changing your flipper shadows to flashers will eliminate all of those goofy problems. So if you haven't done that yet in any of your projects, use flashers as much as you can as opposed to primitives for that kind of thing. It creates far less issues.